Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining today's Lunch and Learn. I hope you have grabbed your lunch and are excited, as I am, to delve deeper into equal pay for equal work, the new European directive on equal pay. So let's get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining. All right. So we have a very good lunch and learn menu for you today. We will start with an appetizer where we are talking briefly about who I am and who is Smart Scale HR, and then we will delve into our main dishes to see what are the key provisions and the enforcement mechanism in the European directive. And finally, we will serve you some dessert about what's going on here and how best to prepare. And finally, we will have some time for Q&A. So let's get started. My name is Michael. I'm the CEO and co-founder. I have been in the last 12 years in various HR roles, very international always. I had various leadership experience, and the last 6+ years I have been in various startups. But just recently I embarked on my most exciting journey, founding Smart Scale HR. And Smart Scale HR is really about transforming pay transparency into a strategic advantage with seamless integration of performance and compensation management for SMEs. So why is it now that we're talking about equal pay for equal work? Especially the principle of equal pay for equal work or work of equal value is established in the European Union since 1958. But unfortunately, there's little progress since then. We're still at a 13% unadjusted gender pay gap in the EU. We will delve a little bit later into the differentiation between unadjusted and adjusted gender pay gap. And the other not so promising thing is that there's only a very slow progress. So 10 years ago, it was at 16%, so 3% over 10 years, definitely things we need to get better at. If we are then looking a little bit further, we also see that there is a global push for more regulations. We see that in the US, we see Australia that recently passes a law, Japan, so really a global push towards more regulation. And the other thing is we can also see is that there is a shift in the society. Boomers hate to talk about their pay. Younger generations are much more open. And the Gen Z, which is expected to be already a quarter of the global workforce next year, is expecting full pay transparency. So these are definitely good reasons for dealing with pay transparency now. So let's get started with our main dish. And before we really can dive into the key provisions of the directive, I think it's important to understand the differentiation between what is a directive versus a regulation. A directive, like the Equal Pay for Equal Work Directive, needs to be transposed into national law before it can be enforced. So that means also that there is a certain room for interpretation for transposing it into national law. And we will see later also some areas where we are expecting that. While on the other side, a regulation is directly enforceable. Best case here, or most notably here, most probably the GDPR, which can be enforced automatically or directly by citizens and companies. So let's continue here with our Equal Pay for Equal Work Directive, or the more technical name is the 2023/970 Directive of the European Union. And if we're looking into Article 1, it says it lays down the minimum requirements to strengthen the application of the principle of equal pay for equal work or work of equal value between men and women through pay transparency and reinforced enforcement mechanism. So there's a lot already packed in this first article. As we said before, it's the minimum requirement. National laws can be more stricter, but not weaker than those minimum requirements. It's about equal pay for equal work or work of equal value. And it's also very clear made here that it's between man and woman, and that the mechanism they are trying to achieve here is through pay transparency and other enforcement mechanism that we will dive deeper into later. When we talk about pay transparency, there is clearly an intention to reduce the gender pay gap in this whole directive, but of course we will all benefit from more pay transparency. Just imagine a company with only men. Also here we will need to comply with the regulations, so we will increase here also pay transparency within the workforce. And Article 34 also made very clear that that needs to be transposed into national law, and that needs to be done until the 7th June of 2023. And hold on, I know that's already almost 2 years, in the future, but you will see in a minute why it's important to already start dealing with it now and preparing you and your organization on these changes. So let's continue. In Article 2, it is defined the scope of the directive. It's made clear that this is for all employers in the public and in the private sectors, and it's for all workers who have an employment contract or an employment relationship. So not for contractors, but for everyone who has a certain employment relationship. The directive is always referring here to workers, so just for nomination, for definition, that means all employees. Article 3, and in Article 5, that's the only exception here. That also applies for applicants, so people that do not have yet an employment contract or an employment relationship. Article 3, there's a lot of definition, but here it is also again re-emphasized that the purpose of this directive is to address the gender pay gap and that the obligations of this directive do not apply for any other protected ground of discrimination like ethnicity, age, or religion. So just for you to keep here in mind. So the first question always is, what is equal work and work of equal value? And despite the fact that there is a certain definition, in my opinion, it's still very vague. Article 4 says here that pay structure shall be based on objective and gender neutral criteria, and that those criteria shall include things like skills, effort, responsibility, working condition, but also job-specific factors as long as they are objective and gender neutral. And interestingly for me was that it was also mentioned not to forget about certain soft skills. Again, very vague. And if we're looking into Article 19, it's even getting more confusing, because when we're doing an assessment of what is equal work or work of equal value, it describes there that the situation we need to take into consideration is not limited to the same employer. So we need to compare one role at one employer with the same role at another employer to define whether this is equal work or work of equal value. And we also are not limited to the same time. So it's not the same time, not the same employer that we need to compare. So quite challenging. And we will see in the jurisdiction how this needs to be understood. It further describes in Article 19 that in order to get some evidence, we can use statistics or comparison, how worker would be treated in a comparable situation. But again, it's very vague of really the definition of equal work and work of equal value. Therefore, it is really important that you have strong arguments internally of what you define as equal work and work of equal value. And the stronger your arguments are, the better for you in case of a lawsuit. So let's continue here. I mentioned before Article 5, that's the only exception of the fact that you need to have an employment relationship. That is really about pay transparency prior to employment. Here it's stipulated that applicants have the right to receive information about the initial pay or its range and the applicable collective agreement provision. This information needs to be provided prior to the job interview. It suggests here in the job description to ensure, and I think that is very interesting, an informed and transparent negotiation on pay. So this directive has this clear purpose to strengthen the position of the employees in this whole negotiation process. Employers are in the future no longer allowed to ask for applicants' pay history. One of the best examples I can think of is here in Austria. In Austria, you have already to put into the job description the minimum salary and the collective agreement provision. In my understanding, that would be not enough for being compliant with the new regulations, because a range needs a start and an end point. And if we are only giving here the minimum wage we're paying, that would be not enough and sufficient to be compliant with the upcoming regulations. In Article 6 and 7 and ongoing, we're talking about pay transparency in the ongoing relationship. So Article 6 clearly stipulates the employer need to make criteria accessible, which are used to determine pay level, and pay progression. So we need to be very clear about that. And it also allows here member states to exempt employers with less than 50 employees, but only from the obligation related to pay progression. So still, as a smaller employer, you still need to make the criteria accessible for the determined pay and pay level, but not for pay progression. Important. And as we've mentioned at the beginning, it's a directive, so it needs to transpose into national law, and that's one of the areas where we see a different interpretation and a diverse range of how different countries will apply that. Important here, when we're talking about pay, this means according to the directive, ordinary basic wage and salary, and any other consideration in cash or in kind, which a worker receives directly or indirectly, for example, variables. And this definition can be found in Article 3 of the directive. One important pillar for this whole directive is Article 7 and the right to information. So USD employee have the right to receive information about your individual pay level and the average pay level. But please, I always get that question. Oh, so I will now see everything and everyone what they are earning? No, it's not. So you see the average pay level broken down by sex for categories of workers performing the same work as them. So it's important that we are defining here the we are defining here the categories for the employees and the workers in a certain area. This right to information can be done directly or through your workers' representative, and the employer has the obligation to inform all workers about this right annually. When there is a request, you as the employer have to provide the information within 2 months. And another important factor is that in the future, there's no application of a non-disclosure about pay. So you cannot contractually agree on that. So it should be that every employee has the right to talk about their own pay as they like. Important here is to understand that this is only related to their own pay. Of course, they are not allowed to share any details about pay strategy and pay information about others. It's really about their own pay. If we then dive deeper, another important pillar for this whole directive is the reporting obligations. And there are several things that needs to be reported on. So the gender pay gap in complementary or variable components, median gender pay gap, the median gender pay gap in complementary and variable components, the proportion of female and male workers receiving complementary or variable components, the proportion of female and male workers in each quartile of the pay band, the gender pay gap between workers by categories of workers broken down by ordinary basic wage or salary and complementary or variable components. So those are the things that you need to start reporting on. The big question is when we need to do that. For employers with 250 workers or more, that starts on the 7th June of 27, and thereafter every year. For smaller organization, between 150 and 249. It also starts on the 7th of June in 2027, but only every 3 years thereafter. And for small organization between 100 and 149, that only starts in 2031. And also the obligation afterwards is only to do that every 3 years. Again, here the hint for that's a directive. So every member state can define that and interpret that differently, especially what is happening for organizations with less than 100 employees. You might think, oh, wow, cool, 2027 and then or 2031. So there's enough time. And I agree, it's really a lot in the future. But you will see in a minute why it's important already to start thinking about it now. and we are looking here into who should receive this information. Of course, we need to report it to national authorities, but we also need to make it available on our website or publicly available, and the directive here suggests the website. The information on point G, so the gender pay gap between workers by categories of workers broken down by ordinary, basic wage, or salary, and complementary or variable components, needs to be provided to all workers, workers' representative, labor inspectorates, and equality bodies upon request. And here it comes. If there is a request and if you have the information available, you also need to provide the information from the previous 4 years. So let's fast forward 2027, 4 years, that would mean 2023. So you might be requested to provide that information already starting 2023. So you need definitely to get your ducks into the row for having the data available and being able to do these reports as requested by the directive. Last article for the key provision is around joint pay assessment. Only if the following 3 things apply, you have to do such a joint pay assessment. First thing is there needs to be a difference in the average pay level between male and female workers of at least 5% or more. There is no justification based on objective gender neutral criteria. So now we are talking about the adjusted pay gap, and no remedy within 6 months after the identification of that. I spoke at the beginning about the unadjusted pay gap. So the unadjusted pay gap is comparing the average hour rate of male and female. And here we have within the European Union an average gender pay gap of 13%. The adjusted pay gap takes into consideration objective and gender neutral criteria, composable factors like education, like responsibility, like skills. And if we then afterwards still have 5% or more gender pay gap, there is no other justification or no other reason than purely discrimination. And that is what this joint pay assessment is really all about, to identify that and to find here ways to mitigate and reduce that gender pay gap. The assessment, which needs to be done with the workers' representative, needs then to be shared with all workers, the worker representatives, monitoring bodies, labor inspectorate, and equality bodies. So I hope you enjoyed the first part of your main dish. Next plate here will be about the remedies and the enforcement. So if we're looking here into Article 14 and 15, of course, the member state needs to ensure easy access to court proceedings for the workers who consider themselves as wronged, but also having the opportunity here to get the support or having here entities to go in front of court on behalf of those workers. Article 16 then describes the right to claim and obtain full compensation or reparation for damages. And this will include full recovery of the pay and related bonuses or payments in kinds, compensation for lost opportunities, non-material damages, any damages caused by other relevant factors, and interests of arrears for those damages. So this is something really taking into consideration that it's about full compensation or reparation and not the lump sum that you might have seen in the past in such cases. Something I'm very bullish about because I think that has the biggest effect for everyone, and regardless of size and regardless of a maturity of you as an organization, and that is the shift of the burden of the proof. That means in the future, you as the employer have to prove that you did not discriminate your employees. And I think that is super difficult at the moment if you do not have the documented decisions, the criteria took into consideration to really prove that end to end. And I think that will make the biggest change. And that is also the reason why I think that this whole directive will have a huge impact on employees and employers in the future, and as soon as it is enforceable. Because we will not see here a long time period to wait until we see the first cases. If we fast forward into 2023, 2026, and you might have someone who is leaving the company, with bad blood, then you might face already here legal actions based on that, because the directive clearly says if there is a worker who considered themselves wrong and there are facts from which it may be presumed that there has been a direct or indirect discrimination, it is you, the employer, who needs to prove that you did not discriminate. So I think that's really a game changer in this whole conversation. When it comes then to the enforcement, Article 21 is talking about the limitation period. The limitation period shall not begin to run before the claimant is aware or can reasonably be expected to be aware of it. The limitation period shall not be shorter than 3 years, and the member states may decide when does the limitation period begins and not. In Article 22, it is talking about the fact that if the court assess, in accordance with national law, whether the unsuccessful employee had reasonable grounds for bringing the claim up, it is appropriate not to require the claimant to pay the cost of the proceedings. So that means even if you're successful with defending the legal action, you might need to pay at least for your own legal costs in this regard. Last, we're talking about penalties, and here it's very vague, so we will see in the future a wide variety of penalties across the different countries. Article 23 here is only telling that the directive expects member states to lay down the rules on effective and proportionate penalties, which needs to guarantee a real deterrent effect with regard to the infringement. And it made clear that the penalties should include fines, but those are based on national law. Interestingly, in the prefix, the directive suggests to base these fines on employer's gross annual turnover or on the employer's total payroll. So very similar to what we have seen with the GDPR, with a certain percentage of the global annual turnover. So we will see how this will end up in the countries, but definitely something which can be quite hefty for some of the organization. Last but not least, the directive also wants to ensure compliance by enforcing it through public contracts. So if you're not compliant, you might be excluded of the public tenders, and public bodies can include penalties and termination clauses to ensure this compliance. So I hope you are not yet completely full. We just finished our main dish, so let's continue with our dessert for today. So the first thing is how now to prepare and when to start with it. And the best thing I can tell you is not to do it like this ostrich here. Really proactively approach it. And here are the 7 steps that I would recommend to do. First things first is get the buy-in from the leadership team. You need to make them aware that this is coming, it is happening, there is no way around it, and that the risks are quite high. And the probability is even high, because again, if you're an employer with a couple of hundred employees, you have to do that. There might be ending up someone who feels discriminated now with the burden of the shift. The shift of the burden, it makes it much more easier to go in front of court. So definitely here a good argument for paying a lot of attention to it. Afterwards, you should conduct a pay audit, assess the current pay structure, analyze any pay gaps you might have, review and implement transparent pay policies. As we have mentioned before, that's really the foundation of this whole directive, that we have objective and gender neutral criteria in place. You might need to review and revise your job architecture to define what is equal work or work of equal value. And then I think that's the most important is engage with employees as early as possible. Explain the reason for the changes, prepare them for the upcoming new level of transparency, because also that's a huge change for them. Educate them on how to use it, the new data, how to interpret that new data, and finally also giving them the channels to voice any concerns that they might have. As an HR organization, of course, you also need to provide training for HR and the management, how to talk about pay in a more transparent way. Utilizing here technology tools like SmartScale HR really enables company to ensure compliance and transparency across the whole talent management process. Because what we have seen is it's about the gender pay gap, yes, but this is just the ultimate or the final outcome. We really need to address the underlying root causes of the gender pay gap. So we need to look into things like job architecture, job grading. We need to look into performance management. How do we evaluate performance management? What are the criteria we're taking here into consideration to have a transparent and objective way of assessing that and using it as an input for merit increase processes. So with that, we are ending it here. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you might have at this point of time. If not, then I would like to thank you very much. If you have any further questions, if you need any support with convincing your leadership team, if you need any support in preparing your organization for these upcoming changes, please feel free to reach out to me. And I'm looking forward to see you in one of our next, with some articles being vague, how will this impact, with some articles being vague, how will this impact implementation for companies and what exposure could this pose for companies and potential lawsuits? Very good question. I think what we now first need to wait for is the national laws in regards to that. We now know the minimum requirements, but we are expecting in some of the areas really a wide variety of what is expected from country to country. So I think the next step for us is really to wait until we get here the national laws. Depending also, of course, which countries you are operating in. So then we know more about that. The minimum requirements we do know, but again, there will be a wide variety of different interpretation of those clauses. All right. Eddie, thank you very much for joining until the end of the webinar. I hope you got some good input, and yeah, hope to see you all soon in one of the next Lunch and Learns. Thank you very much.